Hello, welcome to the Research Cat. In today's video, what I want to do is take a look at the concept of paradigm shifts. It occurred to me while I was looking around this week and talking to a few people about last week that the understanding of what a paradigm is and a paradigm shift is not that well understood. I'm going to have some links down into the bottom for anybody who's interested. They can move on. And just going to give a pair of examples in a pretty short video. I think sometimes paradigm is one of those terms that people like to throw around, but aren't really certain how it functions or how it works, at least from a scientific perspective. So a paradigm itself is just a paradigm itself, not exactly what I wanted, is just a framework that is widely accepted. So in this case, a framework is, it could be anything. In our two examples, we're going to use one example, which is the internet, and one example is the geocentric versus heliocentric astronomical model. There's other paradigm shifts. There's paradigm shifts that have to do with gender, for instance, of the way that gender has evolved, the roles of gender have evolved. This was actually addressed. I was watching a video that it was addressed on Netflix, I believe, on Bill Nye addressed this, where there's an old paradigm that there were two genders. And now there is a newer paradigm where most social scientists have written that there is a multiple genders, that there were no longer in a two-gender relationship. But and it is useful to understand because sometimes when people are arguing against change, or they're arguing that this is the way that we always used to do something, that it's because a paradigm shift has occurred, and when paradigm shifts occur, oftentimes there's a shift in power as well. So let's take a look at a fairly accepted paradigm. And I'm going to use, we can use this one. So it used to be considered that, it used to be considered that the Earth here was in the center of the universe, and that the sun obviously not the scale here, was circling the Earth. I'll have to adjust things a little bit here. So we used to have a model that would look, whereas the sun is on this bad orbit here, and not that one. I should really name my layers, right? This is the, I always tell my students, make sure that you always name your layers so that you can find the things again. Because this is what's going to happen. is I have not named my layers. So I also need to fix my sun because my sun has become hollow somehow. And that in this model, the stars and actually I don't like that sun anymore. We're gonna change that. The in the old model of which is the geocentric model, that is that the Earth was the that the Earth was the center of the universe. This was propagated by people, and it was a comforting belief because the idea is that obviously we're the center, we're the most important of everything. So you had a little bit of power here. However, this changed over to a heliocentric, right? We changed from a geocentric, where the Earth is the center, to the heliocentric, where yes, Earth is still pretty important to us because it's pretty much the only place in the universe that we found we can actually live without significant changes. But we're not necessarily the center of the universe. It's not that the entire universe revolves around us. And so we had this model where it's the in an old paradigm, and this paradigm was accepted for a long time, that this is the way it was going to be. And it played into church teachings, it played into all of the accepted science, but then things changed with Galileo. And so we now have a heliocentric. So if we rearrange our model here, we'll put the sun over the Earth. We'll grab the Earth and, well, we'll grab the Earth, thank you, and we're going to put it up on this orbital track. And we have now a model that looks more like this. Now, of course, there's other planets and things, and we now know that the sun, in fact, rotates around the center of the galaxy, right? So we've actually moved away, but from a solar system, we're still on a heliocentric idea, where the sun is the center of our solar system. And we have these elliptical orbits due to the gravity of the solar system. I mean, the gravity of the sun. So the gravity of the sun pulls the Earth around in its orbit. When this paradigm shift occurs, the old framework of a geocentric model, where the Earth is the center, is tossed aside. And the new model of the sun is the center, and the various planets represented by this blue ball of Earth here is rotating around the sun, is the new model of a paradigm that's accepted. Now, it may be in turn replaced somewhere else in the future by a different model. And there is a resistance that's going to occur due to the power that is set into an existing framework. There's the example in astronomy of, we used to have, it was considered 9 planets. Then Pluto is not considered to be a 9th planet anymore. Scientists did these studies and said, well, you know, it's not exactly a planet. And so instead it got reclassified and we're down to 8 planets. But not everyone has accepted that science. The paradigms, while they do represent a framework that is widely accepted, there is also, from a sociocultural viewpoint, there is also a framework of power associated inside of that. I found it interesting on the planetary example of Pluto, and I'll put that link down in the description, but you essentially had people saying, well, who are these astronomers and scientists thinking that they know what's going on in their field of study that they research and conduct tests in and know what they're talking about? Why are they making these changes? And at the one time, it's kind of ironic because you have people outside of the astronomy field making assertions and really resistant to the change, and yet at the same time the astronomers are the ones who should absolutely be making that change. But it's also very understandable, simply because the way that we are taught and the way that we grow up and those kinds of memories that we have are all hinged upon a set of information that we know, and we tend to be very resistant to change. We also become more resistant to change as we grow older. And I did talk about this in an earlier video. It has to do with the plasticity of the brain, but in general, and there are exceptions, but in general, as we grow older, we become more resistant to change. So this is one model. Now the internet is a different model. And if you look at, I have no idea how I would draw the internet, but I'm going to make an attempt. And I'm going to do that by drawing, perhaps badly, some boxes. So we have a model of we'll make it I'm sure the internet is green. So what we'll do, I don't really want to do that. So what we'll do is we have a computer. Now, if you go back before the internet, and I guess I should point out that when we look at looking at the internet framework, we should make a distinction between the internet, and we probably should also make a distinction between the World Wide Web. I know that many people use them interchangeably, and they are not actually interchangeable. So the internet is your connections that you're using, whether you're currently on Wi-Fi or you're on a landline, and you're just connecting between different devices. The World Wide Web is what many people talk about now when they talk about the internet. The internet is the series of protocols that run the World Wide Web that allows you to do your Google and various things that you're able to do. The World Wide Web is actually a European invention, and it has not been around very long considering how many changes that it's propagated. It's dates to somewhere around 2000, 2001. I'll put a link in the bottom between the difference between the internet and the World Wide Web for people who are interested in it. But there is a difference between them. We have the internet first, and then later on the World Wide Web, which has the search engines and the connections between the various countries. And it is a completely different idea that a person has the ability to go in and look at a United Kingdom video in real time being able to be broadcast, for instance. That is just unheard of at any point of earlier human history. We have more knowledge now than we've had in our entire time of human history. And so there's these connections now that can be done to all of these probably badly done nodes on a computer network, represented here by the green squares. And we have the actual lines from it, and there's going to be a server here that runs this entire part. This framework is a paradigm shift from older models of communication. Because I'm, well, getting older, perhaps, I remember when the computers were first becoming popular in the commercial and in the residential sectors. When I first started college, I didn't actually have, we had a typewriter, or we would write reports out longhand. But most of my early college reports were written on a typewriter. I went to, on my bachelor's degree, I was on an Atari 800. And I don't think that people, at least the younger people today, can remember what it was like where you had to load in on a disk, on a 5.5-inch floppy disk. You load in your operating system, you pull out your operating system, and you put in then your Word software program. Then you have to pull that out to save it because there's no internal saving. There's no operating system. Those were all paradigm shifts that occurred. A paradigm shift is simply when one widely accepted framework gets replaced by another framework, and the old framework is completely gone. But it doesn't mean that everything in the old framework is gone. It could mean that simply the parts have evolved. You have a new framework with the old parts that have been added into it. Now, the same with the World Wide Web and the internet, you do have some power shifts. Social media is up on the rise. And companies that have been able to leverage, especially in the media, that have been able to leverage the web to be able to reach people and are using the tools inherent to the internet to be able to connect with their audience, have done okay, where more traditional newspapers and magazines have not necessarily done well. They've been replaced. There's also a factor of you're exposed to more ideas. If I want to do research now on a topic, I can sit and go to Google Scholar, or I can go to Academic OneSearch, or ProQuest, or EBSCOhost. But if I went back into a previous paradigm, I would have had to go into an actual library. That doesn't make libraries irrelevant. It means that the role of the library has to change. It has to evolve as the technology evolves. In this example of the World Wide Web, we're looking at an evolution that is largely technological. And while there are some cultural aspects to it, there are also it's largely being pushed forward by the fact that our technology is increasing, and it's accelerating our technological curve, that we're able to discover more computers in a very short time, and our next discovery occurs in a shorter time yet than that. Part of it due to simulation modeling, that we can use one technology to model the next technology. But there are also cultural revolutions that are occurring. There's gender, like we talked about before. There's educational models that are changing, which I'm always very interested in. The one model in education that has basically changed, although not as much as I would like, perhaps. But one is that the idea that a student comes in, sits in a row, listens to a lecture, and is a passive receiver is pretty much gone now, at least in accepted educational theory. I can't speak for your exact school or college, but it is expected now in educational theory, in the scholarship at least, that students will ask questions. They will not just sit there and passively say, just, you tell me whatever I need to know and I'll just put it on the test and go. And the reason is that we have changed the understanding for how people are learning. We talked about this in the intelligence video, that people are not just going to fill their brains up with knowledge. That isn't actually the way things work. We actually have to pass things between our intelligence and our memory, and we don't really understand how intelligence works. We don't receive passively. We receive in a more complicated communication with an evolved communication model. And so our cultural understanding of how a school needs to work has to have more activities for a student. Now, there are people who will say, well, I worked out just fine, and I came up to and I was just in this passive environment. I consider this personally to be a pretty nonsense argument. Because, first of all, the students that are coming through school now have to know more than you did. And when we teach students now, let's say that I have a kindergartner. I can't be teaching the kindergartner the knowledge that he needs to go out into the working world today because he's 5. He's not going out into the working world today. I need to teach that kindergartner how she is going to go out into the working world 12 years from now, or 18 years from now. So I have to look into something and say, well, this is what we can take our best hypothesis, an educated guess of what the world is going to look like and what they need to know. Sometimes I will hear adults say things like, well, kids today, they don't even know where all the states are in the United States. Is it useful to know? Yes, if you're in the United States, perhaps. On the other hand, we have maps. They're readily available. You can pull them up on your phone and you can find out what you need to know. Not only can I find out where exactly Wisconsin is in relation to wherever I am, I can plot out the route and it will tell me the hours and the walking time. And I can assure you I'm not going to walk to Wisconsin from New York. But it's a strange piece of knowledge, right? That we would require that. Are we also going to require that we know where all of the capitals are in Europe? That's not relevant information for most of us. Perhaps a geography major or a politician or certain activists. But for most people, that's not a relevant information. And so the evolved paradigm here on education is we will look it up. So we have less emphasis on an old paradigm, which is memorization, rote memory, and more emphasis on an idea that we need to have better research skills. We need to be able to look up information. We need to know what is fact and opinion and be able to identify that information. So there is again an evolved paradigm that has to do with education. What can happen is that people do not want to have the change. I'll have a video pretty soon on change theory. There's quite a bit on change theory that we don't just change our minds. We don't just say, you know, I'm going to embrace this new idea. The way that people change their minds is actually an entire field of psychology. And it's studied by military leaders, it's studied by educators, it's studied by politicians on how am I going to get the people, my audience, the people that I'm talking to, the people that I'm giving a message, how am I going to have that change? And I want them to now follow my ideas over possibly their previously held ones. Having a strong educational underpinning is one possibility, but there are other possibilities. There's anecdotal evidence, which we've talked about before, is very powerful. It's a way of changing somebody's mind to possibly accept a new framework. But from a scientific point of view, it's not really relevant. This, however, can become an issue because I perhaps have based my current understanding of a framework on what my parents have said. And now some scientist is coming and saying, well, that's wonderful that you learned that, but that's not really relevant to what we're doing, right? Anecdotal evidence is not actually evidence. It's not evidence because, to misquote Dr. Tyson, humans are terrible collectors of information. We are not very good at collecting information and then being able to report it correctly. We're not good at that because we attach all these ideas onto that. We don't take it as just evidence. The evidence has some sort of a meaning. It's encoded. And it's encoded with some sort of a context. So when we look at paradigm shifts in research, we need to look at what the previous framework is, or I guess was, would be more accurate, what the previous framework was, what the current framework has become, and why that has occurred. And then we're also going to have to accept that there is a cultural and a power shift that occurs alongside of these that has occurred inside of our framework. And that is the reason that people are reluctant to accept that the gender role has changed, the science role has changed, the technological role has changed. That when that evolution occurs, the power can also change. As a researcher, being aware of the power is often termed as critical theory. I've seen it as critical power theory as well. But looking and saying, you know, that's the old way, here's a new way, and instead of, I would suggest that, especially for students, instead of saying, well, you know, I just don't like it, instead looking at it and saying, why has this change occurred? Where is the evidence? And then trying to find some way that you could read the evidence in a different way. Is there something that hasn't been considered? That's part of the role of the researcher, is looking at older studies. Sometimes I'll see, especially on social media, someone who will argue against one of these paradigm shifts, and they've read just an abstract, if that. And sometimes they'll post, by the way, things like there's a series out there spun by a UK author called I think it's H Bomber Guy, and he points out that they don't actually read the studies that they're quoting, that they're resisting these paradigm shifts. I would say that pretty much most of his videos are a discussion of a paradigm shift that has occurred and the reaction against that, a pushback against that change. So to summarize here, a paradigm, just ignoring the shift part here, the paradigm itself is a widely accepted framework. And the paradigm shift is, and that was actually done by first popularized by Kuhn, the idea that a paradigm is going to shift and become a different paradigm, a different framework that is widely accepted. The old framework falls by the wayside, but elements of the old framework may still be found inside of the new framework. For students that are looking at examples of paradigms to look at, the geocentric to heliocentric model is a very good one. There's tons of information about it, and it's now historical fact. You can also use the model of the atom. The Bohr's model of the atom is a very common one, that you have a nucleus, and then you have electrons that surround it, sort of like the solar system there, and things circulate around it. It's not really an accepted paradigm anymore. We've changed that. I'll put that link down into the description below, but it's one that's very easy to visualize. And so we are kind of resistant to change, because the idea now that electrons are a shell, not an orbit, is not one that's as easy to grasp. The new model of a atom is more that it's like an onion that you're peeling off the layers of electrons to get to the nucleus. And so that's a little harder to visualize. We can accept, when you're looking at these paradigm shifts, they're generally occurring in a technological or cultural, but there is a power element added to them. And part of the role of the researcher is to not get caught up in that power. That we want to look at it from a distanced viewpoint without being subject to that power. We talked about in the previous video about confirmation bias. That's part of it. I suggest to my students that when we're looking at research, you want to have that distance. If you have any questions, you can please put them down below. Either I will address them in the comments, or I will end up doing a future video on them. If you found this video to be helpful, you can always hit the like button or the subscribe button. And I will see you next week.